Imagine you survived the worst genocide in human history. You watched your parents disappear into trains headed for death camps. You barely made it out alive. And then, decades later, you discover that the money your family trusted to Swiss banks, money meant to protect them, was still sitting there. But the bankers wouldn't give it back. They wanted a death certificate. From Auschwitz. There is a town in western Hungary called Topolka. In the early 1940s, it was a quiet place. Cobblestone streets. Church bells in the morning. The smell of bread from bakeries that had been open for generations. And in that town lived a woman named Katalin. She was young. Newly married. In love with a doctor named Zoltan who was serving with the Hungarian army on the Eastern Front, surrounded by carnage and cold. But Zoltan wrote her letters. Every week. Sometimes more. Letters full of love. Letters full of hope. Letters that traveled across a continent at war and still found their way home to her. Until one summer. The summer of 1944. The letters started coming back. Unopened. Stamped with 4 words that changed everything. Sent to an unknown place. But the place was not unknown. It had a name. It was called Auschwitz. Katalin's family was not poor. Her father Adolf ran the Lessner Wine Company, a business with roots stretching back to 1703, a company that had sold wine to the Austro-Hungarian nobility for more than 2 centuries. They were part of Hungary's Jewish middle class. Educated, cultured, well-connected. And like many Jewish families across Eastern Europe, they had done something smart, or so they thought. They had moved their wealth to Switzerland. Because for centuries, Jewish communities in places like Poland, Russia, and Hungary had lived under the shadow of persecution. Pogroms. Confiscations. Governments that could collapse overnight and take everything with them. Switzerland was different. Switzerland was safe. It was neutral. It was stable. Its banks were legendary for their discretion, their precision, their absolute reliability. Katalin's dowry, her inheritance, her future, had been deposited in a Swiss bank by her father. And she believed with complete faith that when the war was over, it would be waiting for her. Now think about this for a moment. These were not desperate people hiding coins under floorboards. These were sophisticated families who understood finance. They transferred their wealth through proper banking channels. They opened accounts with real names, real account numbers, real documentation. And they didn't do it out of greed. They did it out of fear. Because they could see what was coming. The persecution had been building for years. In Hungary, anti-Jewish laws had been passed as far back as 1938, limiting Jewish access to universities, to professions, to public life. But unlike Poland or Russia, Hungarian Jews had not yet been slaughtered in mass. Not yet. Hungary's ruler, Admiral Miklós Horthy, was an aristocratic anti-Semite who had aligned his country with the Nazis in hopes of recovering lost territories. But even he seemed to hesitate at the full extermination of his country's Jewish population. So Hungarian Jews held on. They stayed. They hoped. They sent their money to Switzerland and told themselves that if the worst came, at least their families would have something on the other side. And then March 1944 arrived. The Germans invaded Hungary. And everything changed in a matter of weeks. Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat of death, installed himself at the Hotel Majestic in Budapest. He had a plan. He had a schedule. He had trains. In late June 1944, a conference was held at Siafok, a resort town on the shores of Lake Balaton. People ate well. They drank. They admired the glittering water in the summer sun. And between courses, they finalized the plans to deport and murder the Jews of Western Hungary. It was a Hungarian version of the Wannsee Conference, where Nazi leadership had sat around a table near Berlin less than 3 years earlier and turned genocide into a bureaucratic checklist. At Siafok, local police chiefs and administrative officials signed off on what they knew would be death sentences for their own neighbors. One key figure, Laszlo Endre, a fervent anti-Semite and Secretary of State, had become so close to Eichmann that Eichmann once reportedly said Endre wanted to devour the Jews of Hungary with his own hands. Endre was hanged as a war criminal in March 1946. But by then the damage was done. The deportations from Western Hungary began. Katalin Silag, her parents, her brother, they were all herded into freight cars. Between 70 and 90 people per car. 2 buckets. One filled with water. The other left empty until it wasn't. The windows were bolted shut. The doors locked from the outside. And the trains moved east. By the summer of 1944, Auschwitz was receiving between 12,000 and 14,000 human beings a day. The extermination machinery had been upgraded for maximum efficiency. Crematoria renovated. Furnaces relined. Railway lines extended to within 200 yards of the gas chambers. At the height of the killing, the smoke from the crematoria was so thick it blotted out the sun. About 400,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered there. Among them, the parents of Katalin Szilag. But here's the thing about human beings. Some survive. Katalin survived. She came home to Hungary after the war. She found Zoltan. They built a life together in Budapest, in a spacious flat beneath the hill where Admiral Horthy's castle once stood, as if history itself had a dark sense of irony. By the time this story was recorded, Katalin was 75. Zoltan was 82. They still had coffee ready for visitors. They were still sharp. Still present. Still very much alive. But Katalin was bitter. Not about the war. Not about the Nazis. About the bankers. Because when the war ended and she tried to reclaim her family's money, the money her father had deposited in a Swiss bank before the deportations, she ran into something she had not expected. A wall. A bureaucratic, polished, Swiss-German wall of silence. "I have no papers," Katalin explained. "Everything was destroyed in 1944. My parents were taken to Auschwitz and never came back. I was the only one to return." She knew the money existed. It was family history. Her father had 5 sisters, and each one had 100,000 Swiss francs paid into a Swiss bank account as part of their dowry. It was talked about. It was understood. But the bank wanted documentation. And when the Szilags wrote to the Swiss Bankers Association in 1996, asking for help locating the family account, the Ombudsman's office replied with a form. "Pay us F100, about $44 American, and they might help you." Katalin was a pensioner. "Money is the god of Swiss bankers," she said, drawing on a cigarette. And she meant it. Here's what most people don't know. The Swiss banking secrecy laws that protected those accounts, laws introduced in 1934, were introduced, in part, specifically to protect Jewish depositors. The Nazis were pressuring Swiss banks to reveal the identities of German Jews with foreign accounts. The secrecy laws were meant to shield those people. But after the war, those same laws became a weapon used against the very people they were designed to protect. When Holocaust survivors and their descendants came forward to claim their inheritance, the banks hid behind those laws. We cannot confirm or deny the existence of any account. We cannot verify this after 50 years. And in the most grotesque twist of all, the banks demanded death certificates. Death certificates from people who had been gassed and cremated and whose ashes had been scattered across Polish soil. There were no death certificates from Auschwitz. The Nazis didn't issue paperwork for the people they murdered in secret. Now think about that. The system designed to protect you becomes the instrument used to rob you. And the people doing the robbing were wearing suits, sitting in beautiful offices overlooking Lake Geneva, and claiming they were simply following procedure. Katalin Szilag was not alone. Hundreds of miles to the north, in the Polish city of Lodz, another family had made the same calculation. His name was Velvel Singer. By any measure, Velvel was one of the wealthiest Jews in all of Poland. He had built a financial empire from the ground up, refurbishing and selling sewing machines across Eastern Europe. He lived in what was said to be the most beautiful private home in Lodz. He traveled. He dealt internationally. He had resources. And like any prudent man who understood what was happening in Europe in the late 1930s, he moved his money. $4 million in American funds according to family accounts. Deposited somewhere in a Swiss bank. A photograph survives of Velvel and one of his sons. They stand together outside a forest near Lodz. Velvel is the picture of dignity, trimmed beard, black frock coat, shoes shined like mirrors. His tie is neatly knotted. His gaze is confident. His posture speaks of a man who has built something. The boy beside him is a miniature version of his father. On the back of the photograph, a note written in Yiddish, "I wasn't feeling well for a while. Now I'm better." By September 1939, the Germans had marched into Lodz. Swastikas flying over cobblestones that had known Jewish life for centuries. Jewish institutions immediately shuttered. Bank accounts frozen. Businesses handed to Germans. And then, the ghetto. About 164,000 Jews were forced into an area of just over 1.5 square miles. The Lodz ghetto was different from others. It was profitable. The Nazi ghetto governor, Hans Bibo, set up factories, workshops, production lines. The Jews were paid in soup and bread. They made uniforms for German soldiers, vehicle parts, textiles, industrial goods. The ghetto generated roughly 350 million Reichsmarks for the Third Reich, about 140 million American dollars. It made so much money that even the Nazis couldn't quite bring themselves to shut it down. For a while. Velvel Singer ran the machine shops inside the ghetto. He was known as a mensch, that untranslatable Yiddish word that means something between integrity and simple human decency. Jack Weissblack, a young man who worked in Velvel's factory during those years, still remembered him decades later. He was generous, kind, a quiet man. He didn't bother nobody. He was a good man. For a man in our town, in his line, he was the richest. I cannot tell you how many millions he had. But he was a wealthy man. The ghetto gave Velvel something in return, a few more years of life. As long as the sewing machines were running, as long as uniforms were being sewn, he was useful. And then the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, and the ghetto residents celebrated. They thought liberation was coming. They were wrong. The Nazis had already decided to liquidate the ghetto months earlier. The cattle trucks began rolling in August. Destination Auschwitz. Velvel Singer was taken out to a pit in November 1944 and machine-gunned. Ron Singer is Velvel's nephew, a professor of theater at the University of Toronto. For years he had known the family story, the $4 million in a Swiss bank. The message passed through a survivor who came to the family's house in Montreal in 1945, telling them what Velvel had said before the end. If you survive and make it to my brother in Montreal, tell him there is $4 million in a Swiss bank. But which bank? That was the question. Velvel, like most Holocaust victims who had sent money abroad, had been deliberately vague. He was afraid an imposter might claim it before the right people could. So he told someone the money existed, but not where it was. It's a pattern that echoes across dozens of survivor families. Men and women who knew they might not live. Who told someone nearby, not the details, just the fact. There is money in a bank. If you survive, find my family. Tell them. Ron Singer hired a private investigator in 1987. His name was Terry House. House wrote to the Swiss Consul General. The response was polite, formal, and completely unhelpful. Paragraph 3 of Point 1 of the official procedure stated that anyone wishing to claim an inheritance must provide legal proof of death of the account holder. A death certificate. From Auschwitz. What kind of nonsense is this? Ron Singer said, his voice full of controlled fury. You produced the appropriate documentation like a death certificate for your uncle that died in Auschwitz, and we may consider looking for the money. We come from efficiency to bureaucracy to outright thievery. And we have hit that point now. By the mid-1990s, the pressure was building. The World Jewish Congress, based in New York, had been quietly gathering evidence for years. And they found a powerful ally, Senator Alphonse D'Amato of New York, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. D'Amato's constituency was heavily Jewish. And he was furious. Under his pressure, and with the very real threat of sanctions against Swiss banks operating in the United States, the Swiss banking establishment finally came to the negotiating table. What they found was damning. A 1962 investigation had located only SF 9.5 million in dormant Holocaust-era accounts. A 1996 investigation found SF 38.74 million in 775 dormant accounts. How had 30 million Swiss francs simply not been found for 34 years? The answer was uncomfortable. Some accounts had been quietly moved. Some had been absorbed. Some had been handed over to communist governments in Eastern Europe as part of diplomatic agreements, a detail that deserves its own moment of horror. In 1949, Switzerland had signed a secret compensation agreement with Communist Poland. Warsaw would pay Switzerland for Swiss property confiscated by the communists. In return, unclaimed Polish bank accounts and life insurance policies in Switzerland would be handed over to Poland's central bank. 3 million Polish Jews had been exterminated in the Holocaust. Their Swiss accounts were handed to the very government that now controlled the land where they had been murdered. Less than $400,000 out of the promised 1.6 million was actually handed over. The rest vanished into bureaucracy. Swiss historian Peter Hug put it plainly, "For me, what is morally very, very questionable is that for 50 years Switzerland did nothing to try and find the people this money actually belonged to." And Swiss journalist Gisela Blau was even sharper. The Swiss banks had refused to liquidate private German assets after the war, claiming it would be unethical from a banking standpoint. But those same banks had absolutely no problem liquidating the private assets of Jewish clients who had perished in the Holocaust. One standard for Germans. Another standard for Jews. "This is a scandal," said Blau. That word is used very often. But this was a scandal. Across the Danube from where Catalan Silag lives lies Wesselenii Street. In the winter of 1944, Hungarian Nazi Arrow Cross troops lined up Jews along the riverbanks and shot them into the water. The Danube ran red. The ghetto gate stood at the bottom of that street, smashed aside by Soviet Red Army soldiers in January 1945. History has laid its bloodied hand heavily here. And in the shadow of all that history, elderly survivors were still filling out forms, still paying fees to ombudsmen, still being asked for documents that were burned with their families. Sergio Caras, a Toronto-based lawyer who represented many of these families, said it plainly. My biggest concern is that the people I am dealing with are very elderly. I would like this thing to be resolved quickly. I don't know how long they will be around. I think they deserve some justice once and for all. He paused. Then he asked a question that hangs in the air long after you hear it. I always ask myself, what could their lives have been had the wealth deposited in their accounts been at their disposal? Nobody knows the exact total. Some Jewish organizations have estimated that with 50 years of compound interest, the unclaimed Holocaust accounts in Switzerland could run into hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars. The numbers are staggering. But behind every number is a name. And behind every name is a story. A father who trusted a bank to protect his children. A young wife who believed she would one day collect her dowry. A businessman who whispered his last secret to someone he hoped would survive. Former U.S. State Department official Seymour Rubin had a simple solution. Publish the list. Publish every dormant account. Every name. Every number. Every balance. Let the world see. Let descendants come forward. And if no one claims an account, let it go to charity. Let it do some good. But make the effort. Make it real. There is no reason why the Swiss could not take a census of all their banks, Rubin said. They must have very clear records. That's one thing everybody believes the Swiss are very good at. Here is the truth at the heart of this story. The Jews of Eastern Europe were not naive. They were not foolish. They saw the darkness coming and they did the rational thing, they protected what they could. They trusted an institution that the entire world trusted. And that institution, shielded by secrecy laws, comfortable in its neutrality, profitable in its silence, took their money. For decades. While their families were ash. While their children grew old trying to prove that their fathers had existed. While bureaucrats demanded certificates of death from gas chambers that kept no records. The irony, as Ron Singer said, is almost incomprehensible. The very secret accounts created to shield Jewish wealth from Nazi confiscation became the mechanism by which Swiss banks kept Jewish wealth from Jewish families. The protection became the prison. And the key? Buried somewhere in the files of banks that kept insisting there was nothing to find. Catalan Silag is still waiting. The Singers are still waiting. The Harastis. The Lesners. Families whose names appear in no headline but whose stories sit quietly in the archives of a continent that still hasn't fully reckoned with what it allowed to happen. Not just in the camps, but in the banks. Not just during the war, but after it. The Holocaust did not end in 1945. For some families, the theft was still continuing 50 years later. In beautifully lit lobbies. With marble floors. And polite, formal letters. Signed by men who said they were simply following procedure. The names are still out there. Some of them are still waiting to be found.